but from other sources I learned that Hugh Mainwaring was never the same after his father's death. He grew stern and taciturn, and would allow no mention of his brother's name, and within 2 years he had disposed of the estate and left England forever, while a few years later tidings were received of the death of Harold Scott Mainwaring at sea. I also learned that about this time Richard Hobson suddenly rose from the position of a penniless pettifogger to that of an affluent attorney, though he was engaged in questionable speculations far more than in the practice of law. I visited the chambers of Barton & Barton, and learned through them that everything had been adjusted in accordance with the terms of the will in their possession, which disinherited the elder son, but Hugh Mainwaring's action in disposing of the estate had excited considerable comment. Having pledged them to secrecy, I disclosed my identity, and related to them the story of the old servant. To my surprise, they were inclined to give the story credence, and acting upon their advice, I obtained all possible information regarding Hugh Mainwaring, and when my studies were completed, sailed for America, with the express determination to secure proof and verification of the facts which I had already gathered, and to establish my claim as the legal heir of the Mainwaring estate. I was not without means to do this, as my father had accumulated considerable property during the few years he lived in Australia, and my foster parents are people of wealth. You will understand now, Miss Carleton, why I took the position of private secretary to Hugh Mainwaring. You will realize how eagerly I studied the correspondence between him and Richard Hobson, from which I learned that the latter was extorting large sums of money as the price of his silence regarding some fraudulent transaction, presumably the destruction of the will, and perhaps you can imagine my feelings on discovering, one day, among Hugh Mainwaring's private papers, a memorandum to the effect that the will had never been destroyed, but was still in existence and in his possession. I knew that to make any demand upon him for the document would be worse than useless, as he would never admit my claim. I must find it for myself. I searched for that will as for hidden treasure, and, Miss Carleton, I found it." "Oh!" she exclaimed, unable to repress her emotion. "I am so glad! Do tell me how and when." "I found it on the last day of Hugh Mainwaring's life, within 2 hours after he had signed his own last will and testament." "What a strange coincidence!" It was strange, and it was my discovery on that day which formed the subject of my thoughts on the following night, the night of the murder, and which kept me pacing my room until 3 o'clock in the morning. "Did Mr. Mainwaring know of your discovery?" "No, I had no opportunity to see him that evening until too late, even if I had chosen to broach the subject to him at that time." "Might he not have discovered in some way that you had found the will?" "I think not. Why do you inquire?" "It only occurred to me if it might not be possible that he had reason to think his secret had at last been discovered, and rather than face the consequences committed suicide, but it seems improbable. But to think that you are the son of the one whom I have always considered the noblest of all the Mainwarings, and that you, and not Hugh, are the rightful heir to the old Mainwaring estate! I am more than glad, and Hugh will be glad also. He will not begrudge you 1 shilling or have one unkind thought towards you, though I cannot say the same for his father." "Hugh is a noble-hearted fellow," said Harold warmly. "He has promised me his friendship, and I believe he will stand by it." He spoke briefly of his plans, of his business in London for a few days, and, when the will should have been probated in the English court, of his return to America to establish his claim there. "Mr. Mainwaring," said Miss Carleton after a pause, "I am inexpressibly glad to learn what you have told me, and you have my sincerest wishes for your immediate success. I appreciate, more than I can tell, your confidence in permitting me to be the first to know of your good fortune. May I be the first to congratulate you?" He took the proffered hand, but looking into the beautiful eyes sparkling with happiness, his own face grew serious as he replied, "I thank you for your congratulations and your good wishes, Miss Carleton, but I sometimes question whether my discovery, on that particular day of the will, the last link in the chain of evidence against Hugh Mainwaring, was a matter for congratulation." "How is that?" she inquired quickly. "Do you not see that when all these facts become known, they may be used by my enemies to direct suspicion against me as the possible murderer of Hugh Mainwaring?" "Who would think of such a thing?" she exclaimed indignantly. "Ralph Mainwaring will," was his prompt reply. "He might try to incite the suspicions of others against you, but he would know in his own heart that his insinuations were unfounded." "I have no fear of him," said Harold with a smile. "I only mentioned it to show that I do not anticipate upon my return to America that my pathway will be strewn with roses." He paused a moment, then added, "I had this in mind, Miss Carleton, when I asked you once whether your confidence in me were strong enough to stand a heavy strain, if necessary." She blushed slightly at the reminder, and a look of quick comprehension flashed across her face, as, for an instant, she dropped her eyes before his earnest gaze. When she again looked up, the luminous eyes met his own unwaveringly, as she replied, in firm, low tones, "I will believe in you and trust you to the fullest extent, whatever happens." "I thank you more than I can express," he answered gravely, "for believe me, Miss Carleton, I value your confidence and friendship far above any and every other." "I did not suppose you needed any assurance of my friendship, though after your sudden departure from Fair Oaks I felt somewhat doubtful whether you cared for it." He did not reply at once, and when he did, it was evident he was repressing some strong emotion. "I feel that there is an explanation due you for my manner of leaving Fair Oaks. I am aware that it had the appearance of rudeness, but I can only say that it was from necessity and not from choice. There is something more which I hope some day to tell you, Miss Carleton, but until I can speak as I wish to speak, it is best to remain silent. Meanwhile, I will trust to your friendship to pardon whatever in my conduct may seem abrupt or inexplicable." The conversation was terminated at this point by the appearance of Lieutenant Cohen, whom Harold Mainwaring introduced as an old classmate, and presently all three adjourned to the dining saloon. To Harold Mainwaring and Miss Carleton the remainder of the voyage passed swiftly and pleasantly, and the friendship begun at Fair Oaks deepened with each succeeding day. Though no word of love passed between them, and though Miss Carleton sometimes detected on the part of her companion a studied avoidance of personal subjects, yet, while wondering slightly at his self-imposed silence, she often read in his dark eyes a language more eloquent than words, and was content to wait. It was his desire that the other members of her party should remain in ignorance of his real identity, and as the greater part of the voyage proved somewhat rough, he had little difficulty in preserving his secret. Mr. Thornton and daughter soon made their appearance and greeted the quondam secretary with unaffected cordiality, but Mr. Thornton was too deeply engrossed in renewing acquaintance with one or two old friends to pay much attention to the younger man, while Edith felt in duty bound to devote herself to the entertainment of Mrs. Mainwaring and Isabel, a task which Miss Carleton was not at all disposed to share. Not until the last few hours of the trip, when fair weather had become an established fact and land had been sighted, did Mrs. Mainwaring and her daughter appear on deck, and in the general excitement Harold Mainwaring escaped their observation. The parting between himself and Miss Carleton was necessarily brief. She gave him her address, saying, "I would be delighted if you would consider yourself our guest while in London, and I hope, at least, that I may see you often before your return." "I thank you, Miss Carleton," he replied. "If present circumstances would admit of it, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to accept your invitation, but under existing conditions it is, of course, impracticable. I cannot now say how long I will remain in London, but I wish to make my stay as brief as possible, and to that end shall devote almost my entire time to business. But," he added, with a peculiar smile, "I shall not repeat the offense committed at Fair Oaks. You may rest assured I shall not return to America without seeing you, and I hope at that time to be able to speak more definitely regarding my future." There was that in his eyes as he spoke that suffused the fair English face with lovely color, and caused a tender, wistful smile to linger about the sweet mouth long after he had left her side. He was one of the first to land, and Miss Carleton, watching from the deck, saw almost as soon as he had reached the pier a fine-looking gentleman in the prime of life step quickly out from the crowd, and grasping him cordially by the hand, enter at once into earnest conversation. Harold Mainwaring turned towards the steamer for a parting salute, and as both gentlemen raised their hats, she recognized in the newcomer Alfred Barton, the junior member of the firm of Barton & Barton. She watched them until they disappeared in the crowd, then turning to rejoin her companions, she noted, standing at a little distance, the slender, dark-eyed individual whom she had observed on previous occasions, also watching the scene with a smile of quiet satisfaction, much like that which Mr. Merrick's face had worn at the beginning of the voyage. Chapter 17